Please join me in welcoming Professor Daunton.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I think we all know that cities and local authorities more generally are becoming bankrupt. And the most notorious case was Birmingham in September 2023. Well, legally, they're not bankrupt. Legally, they are issuing Section 114 notices, in which the chief financial officer of a council says that their forecast income does not cover the forecast spending. They are then required to take action to rectify that situation and not to make new commitments. There have been a number of such notices since 2018, as you see here on screen, and at the moment, of 313 local authorities, 127 say that they might follow suit. Local government is facing serious financial pressures, and indeed the National Audit Office has refused to sign off the national government accounts because of the state of local government finance. Well, why is this? The first reason is that local government has a major role in the social care of adults and of children, and that takes up to 60% of the budget. You see there, in fact, 61% of the budget. Those costs are rising as the population is ageing and as demand for adult and children's social care is growing. More children are in care and the costs of largely private provision are high. The problems of what are called SEND, special educational needs, is very high. In March, the Guardian surveyed 108 councils and found chronic underfunding for these needs. They found that 60 to 70 councils were at risk of effective bankruptcy as a result of the crisis in SEND. The deficit in that area of government is likely to be £5 billion in 2026. And so far, that has been kept off the books of councils by what is called an override. Now that expires in March 2026, be back on the books with a grave threat of insolvency. As a result, councils are trying to ration access to these services, which is then leading to cases being brought to tribunals about the failure to provide care. The result of the very high level of spending on adult and children's social care is that other things are squeezed, hence the potholes in roads, which everybody is rightly complaining about. So that's one reason. A second reason is a failure of the central government to provide funding. About half of funding of local government comes from central government through grants and the redistribution of business rates. Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies said, and I quote, "Local councils are supplicants, dependent on the whims and funding arrangements set in Whitehall. And since those funding arrangements are short-term, it's very difficult for councils to plan." Now, of course, central government funding is needed in order to ensure that poorer areas with greater challenges are able to provide decent services. But there has been a reduction in central government support of around 40% in the years of austerity after 2010, and these have predominantly hit poorer areas. Between 2010 and 2020, spending cuts per person in the most deprived 10% of council areas fell by 31%. In the least deprived 10% of councils fell only by 16%. So there's still some redistribution from richer to poorer areas, but much less than in the past. And that redistribution depends upon out-of-date formula and data from as long ago as the census of 2001. Despite, over the last 20 years, major changes in the distribution of the elderly between councils. Again, Paul Johnson says, and I quote, "This is nothing short of scandalous. This is quite simply a fundamental failure of governance, a failure which slowly, insidiously undermines any rational basis for funding local government, and inevitably leads to disillusion, disempowerment, and disengagement." So, with a cut in central government funding, councils are becoming more reliant upon their own resources from council tax. But that council tax is regressive and unfair. Smaller properties pay proportionately more than larger properties, as you see in these graphs here. You see Hartlepool, poor area in the north. The average household is paying more than twice as much as better off people in Westminster, and you get similar data, more detailed data in the other part of that graph. So smaller properties pay more than larger properties. Poorer areas pay more than richer areas. Areas with low deprivation have more valuable property, places like Westminster, and that raises more revenue. Conversely, areas with high deprivation have less valuable property. The result of this is gross inequities in local taxation across the country. The next point to make is that the increase in council tax is capped. Since 2012, unless there is a local referendum or unless the central government gives permission, local authorities with responsibility for social care can only increase their budgets, their council tax, by 5%. District councils which don't have responsibility for social care by 3%. Results of this failure of both central government finance and local government finance is that councils are under pressure to find money from elsewhere. So many district councils raise their money from car parking, from charging for culture, charging for leisure services, charging for planning, and for trade waste. And in some cases, over half of their income comes from these sources. In addition, they turn to borrowing and commercial development. In some cases, quite successfully. Luton owns the airport. Portsmouth, perhaps less obviously, bought a banana export company. Some councils have bought shopping centres, which is not always good business sense. Or they've built up property portfolios outside their own area. They become rental landlords rather than owning their own housing stock within their own district. Now, this approach can go very badly wrong. One of the most notorious cases is Thurrock Council, which lent money to two companies, one a solar energy company and the other a business lender, both of which became bankrupt. There's also a risk of incompetence. Woking, in May 2023, was found to have borrowed £1.9 billion on a net budget of £24 million. The financing costs were £62 million a year. The report on this behaviour said as follows: the council's historic investment and borrowing decisions are disproportionate to its ability to manage complex commercial activity. The council lacks the commercial skills and capacity to identify a longer-term strategy to resolve its commercial arrangements. So the council there was trying to raise money from commercial schemes to pay for social regeneration. But it spent on the social regeneration before the revenue arrived from the commercial developments. and had a very complex funding model, which went seriously wrong. Now, some councils have behaved in a much more business-like way and have been able to raise money to show more resilience, but the dangers are clear. The overall result is serious, as this chart shows. The percentage of change in real terms on core spending in this table. The core spending is defined as all the available spending from council tax and from central government grants. And you see that there's been a fall from 2010 to 2011 per person in spending down to a trough in 2019 to 20. It's gone up a little bit since then, but it's still way below the original level. So the spending per person fell by about a quarter between 2009 and 10 and 2019 to 20. And even more for housing, transport, planning, culture and leisure, which went down even more than that. So how have we ended up in this state of straitened finances and decaying services? It's a world away from the 19th century of Joseph Chamberlain in Birmingham, where Joseph Chamberlain developed a powerful, what he called municipal or civic gospel. The idea that there should be civic pride of ownership of municipal gas and water, which I talked about in my last lecture, making money from the trams, the gas, the electricity, and putting that money into provision of the art gallery in Birmingham or into the new university. A pride in the city as regenerating, raising standards of the population. So why have things gone so badly wrong? From the days of civic pride of Joseph Chamberlain in the 1870s and 80s to bankruptcy in Birmingham in the current decade. So I'm a historian, so I'm going to give you a potted history of how we got from there to now. So let's go back to the Victorian period, when cities were starting to recover from the grimness of the Industrial Revolution, the low levels of social spending, to become the centres of civic pride. Well, they drew their revenue from a property tax, the rates. Rates were paid by occupiers according to the rateable value of the house, based upon the annual rent, less an allowance for maintenance and so on. Rates were collected in towns by different bodies for different purposes. It wasn't one accumulated, aggregated rate level. One rate was collected by the town council or the Board of Health. Very often they were the same body. And that provided for roads, cleaning, public health, and even for libraries if the majority of the ratepayers voted for it. In these town councils and boards of health, there was a franchise of one vote for each ratepayer if they had property above a certain value. Now, that could be manipulated. You could, in setting the rate value, you could manipulate where the rate was compared with where the level of property was set in order to allow a vote. So in some cities, you had quite a small number of people voting, and others you had quite a large number of people voting. And what seems to happen here is that you have a variation between, in 1852, 11% of people voting in some cities to 52% in other cities. In 1884, it varied from 33% to 87%. And what you find is this. If the franchise is very limited, and it's only the large merchants and industrialists who have the vote, they spend money on large infrastructure. When it widens, so more small shopkeepers come in, on whom the rates largely fall, it becomes very low levels of spending. When you go above 60% of people voting, you get an alliance, which is exactly what Joseph Chamberlain did between the elite, he was himself a major industrialist, and the working class. The elite wants to spend on better infrastructure for gas and water, which helps their business. The workers want to have better social services. So you have this like U-shape level of spending. If it's dominated by small local shopkeepers, as in Birmingham before 1870, mean retrenchment, economy. If it's a larger population of voters, it's an alliance between the elite and the workers. So I'll come back to that point later on because I think it changes in the interwar period. So that's town councils. The other major spending was on the Poor Law. Now, of course, the Poor Law of 1834 was meant to be very harsh. It was meant to stop people becoming welfare dependent. And the franchise was linked with that. There, you had more votes, the more property you owned. And you lost your vote if you became recipients of the Poor Law. So the idea there was that you could have up to 6 votes if you were a major property owner. You lose your vote if you were a welfare dependent. So the idea there was to make sure that welfare was provided on harsh terms. That was abolished in 1894. And that again is going to lead to a change in spending patterns. Now recipients, poorer people, have the vote. And in 1870, school boards were set up. Again, they set a rate, and that's on the basis of one ratepayer per vote. Now, this system of local property rates had serious problems. It gave revenue, but it also had problems. The first, it's very difficult to collect it from working class tenants because they were on weekly tenancies. There's a high level of turnover, but the rates are collected annually. So how did you collect it if you've got 5, 10 people living in the same house? The answer to that was you compound for the rates. The owner pays on behalf of the tenants on who are legally liable. But they will only pay if they're given a discount. So they get up to 50% discount on the rates being collected by the owner of the house. Now, there's a problem here, which I want you to bear in mind when we come to the poll tax, which some of you may remember. In 1867, the Second Reform Act extended the franchise, including to working men, of course, to men. And the Conservative government in 1867 thought this was very dangerous. You're giving the vote to men, but they're not themselves paying the rates. It's being paid by the landlord. Therefore, they don't realise how much money is being paid in tax. They might therefore vote for extravagance. So therefore, they argued, you should only have the right to vote if you directly pay the rates. The result of that was complete chaos in local government finance. If the rate is going to be collected from each tenant as they move from house to house, it's very costly. A lot of people didn't pay. There were, in Birmingham, 54,000 summonses for non-compliance, non-payment in October 1867. So this is exactly, of course, what Mrs. Thatcher wants to do in the poll tax. You should not have the right to vote unless you pay your poll tax. You have to establish the prudence of the voter. If you vote for expensive government, you will pay in your poll tax. Well, it didn't last very long in 1867. By 1869, compounding was restored. But by the late 19th century, it's under pressure. As local authorities are spending more on building better facilities, better schools, and so on, then they want more revenue. And one way to get more revenue is to remove the compounding allowance. But if you reduce the compounding allowance, the people who own working class housing find that their profit is being squeezed. They're not getting the discount. So they more or less go on strike. The small ratepayers who own small housing property are being hit. So you find then this problem again emerging in the late 19th century, the revolt by small ratepayers. There's a big debate then starting about whether or not this system of local government finance is acceptable. It's believed, rightly, that the incidence of rates is unfair, it's regressive. Rent is a higher proportion of the spending of poor people than of rich people or middle class people. So the burden is likely to fall more upon the owners or occupiers of small housing. It's also hitting some businesses more than other businesses. So if you're a business with a large premise or a large factory, you're spending a lot of money. Take the example of Liverpool. This became a serious issue in Liverpool. If you own a shop in Liverpool, then you are paying rates on that property. But suppose you're a merchant in Liverpool and you have most of your capital in ships out on the seas or in goods in a warehouse. They don't pay tax. So you have the Liverpool Land and House Owners Association in 1877 saying, why is it that we shopkeepers and small house owners are building roads over which these goods are going in heavy wagons, which are smashing up the roads, to these ship owners and merchants who are not paying their fair share? So in 1901, a royal commission said that this was completely unrealistic. They said this, I quote, "There is no reason why the owners of rateable property should be singled out for taxation to the exclusion of owners of other property." So we're getting a political mobilisation of ratepayers, especially small property owners, shopkeepers, around this. The rates are going up because there's more expenditure upon better social services and infrastructure. You're squeezing the profitability of small house owners, and there's an unfairness between different types of property. So there's a big debate around 1900, what to do about this. Well, what are you going to do about it? Well, in some cases, local authorities had income from other assets. It's a bit like I was saying earlier on. In fact, in Liverpool, the city council owned the docks. The motto of Liverpool City Council is Deus nobis hac otia fecit, which is translated as God has granted us this ease. Well, one wit said it shouldn't be Deus, it should be Jews, the Jews from the docks. Birmingham, another example, say a lot of income coming from the gas company. So some cities were able to spend more because they had this additional resource. You could also borrow. The Public Works Loan Board, a government body, provided cheap loans. And councils started themselves to go to the London money market on the security of the rates, like Joe Chamberlain did for the building of Corporation Street there on the slide. So they could tap into the money market. The government gave grants and aid from central government, but and that rose from 3.8% of local government spending in 1868 to 14% in 1890. But then there became a problem. George Gresham, Conservative Chancellor of Exchequer, decided the best way to give grants was to allocate to local authorities not a share of all central government spending, but to give them income from particular licences, for example, for dogs or for beer houses. So that was a fixed amount. So it was actually not very satisfactory. It was inflexible and limited. In places like Liverpool I was talking about, these aggrieved ratepayers, small shop owners, they started to say there should be a separation between purely local services, paid for out of the rates, and semi-national services paid for out of central government taxation, which were for the benefit of the entire country. Debate goes on, and it wasn't quite clear how to resolve it. And the Conservatives in 1901 appointed a Royal Commission on the Poor Laws, because the cost of poor relief was going up at this time. They failed to come up with a solution. There was a majority report which said the problem is that the poor are feckless and they ought to be all sent to the workhouse and punished. That will stop them having more money spent on them. The minority, led by Sidney and Beatrice Webb, said, no, that's not the case. It should be all about spending by the central government. The Conservative government didn't know what to do between this, and there's also a deep divide between the Conservatives and Liberals. And this is where I go back to Joe Chamberlain. Joe Chamberlain, a bit like President Trump, thought the answer to everything was tariffs. Because if you have tariffs, then you will have revenue from tariffs, for import duties, and you will also create more employment, which will solve the problem of social welfare. If people are employed, they don't need to go to the poor law. The Liberals thought that tariffs were counterproductive. They would lead to inflation. They would lead to higher cost of living. They demanded free trade as a solution to everything. They had three strategies. One, free trade leads to prosperity. Secondly, they believed in what they called moral reform. You don't punish people by sending them to the workhouse, but you don't make them dependent on the state. What you do is you remove the structural impediments in society to allowing them to take charge of their own lives. And the person who believed that, stated it most clearly, was Winston Churchill and David Lloyd George as great liberal politicians. And I have the quote there from Winston Churchill in 1907. He says, I want to make people, if you like, self-reliant, but you don't do that by allowing them to fall into the abyss. You've got to provide a safety net. If you've got a safety net, they can climb to the top of the Circus Act on their high wire, knowing that if they fall, they will be caught. That would make people more entrepreneurial, more self-reliant, and more dependent. You remove the things which stop people being self-reliant. And Lloyd George in 1908 introduced old age pensions, and the two of them in 1911 introduced unemployment and health insurance. And this is being funded, and this is the third point, from central government taxation in the 1909 budget through progressive income tax, which will fall upon the richer people. But also an attempt to reform local government taxation through land taxation. And I'll come back to that at the end of the lecture. So what they said was tariff reform was designed to protect landowners because it will protect them from cheap food coming in from the United States. It will lead to more expensive food. It will lead to higher rents for great aristocratic landowners. They said that the enterprising people, the merchants, the industrialists in towns, lead to an increase in land values from their enterprise, and that goes to the aristocratic landowners. And that was a misallocation of resource. It was unearned, unmerited growth of income, of wealth. Now, that idea that you should tax the land as unearned wealth goes back to Henry George, the American radical, in his book, Progress and Poverty. And it was picked up by liberals like W.H. Dawson, and the title of his book really sums it up, The Unearned Increment, or Reaping Without Sowing. And he said the solution is clear. You need to tax away the unearned value of land, which is created by the enterprise of people living in town. Henry George believed that was the only tax you needed, the single tax position. This was picked up then by David Lloyd George, here dressed like a French revolutionary, land valuation with the aristocrats being put in the tumbrel, being taken to the guillotine. This cartoon here, Peers Against the People, really sums it up, I think. You see on one side working men with their shovels and cloth caps, alongside industrialists with their top hats. It's enterprise by labour and capital against the peers in their ermine robes. So it was a strategy to create a cross-class alliance against the aristocrats. And that's a position which was, sorry, I beg pardon, going ahead, which was held by Winston Churchill. As he said in 1909, you have a stable society if you have a wide diffusion of property. You break up the big estates, you break up the monopoly of land, and then you tax away that unearned value of land, which is a restraint upon trade. The increase in land values, he said, is a wholly sterile process from merely withholding of a commodity which is needed by the community. So landowners were monopolists who were limiting growth. In 1914, Lloyd George went even further. He wanted to change the entire basis of local taxation. He wanted to abolish the rates and replace it with a national land value tax, a local tax on land. Well, it didn't happen. The war, of course, came along immediately. He had to go into coalition as Prime Minister with the Conservatives. The Conservatives blocked it. The valuation was very difficult to carry out, of course, during the war anyway, but it was also possible to redefine that alliance there to say no, it was actually, the alliance was really between landowners as property owners and industrialists and merchants as property owners against labour. So you redefine at the end of the war the class links. So here we have one major attempt to reform local government taxation, which failed. Now, the next attempt to reform local government taxation, which also fails, is the poll tax. Now, let's see how you get from one to the other. What happens in the interwar period? Well, rates continued in the interwar period without major reform. The Labour Party picked up the liberal idea of land value taxation, but it came to nothing. The Labour government did introduce a land value tax in 1931, just as they lost office, into the national government, and it was repealed. The London County Council kept pressing for bills to tax site values. Again, came to nothing. There was a continued problem of the poor law. As I said, the 1894 workers had one vote per person, so workers could take control over the poor law. With mass unemployment at the end of the First World War, there was a serious issue, as the central government saw it, that workers took control of the poor law boards and were given benefits to unemployed workers, which were too high. And of course that led to problems within parts of London, in the East End of London, where the central government came in and took control and sent various local councils to prison for spending, as they saw it, too much money. So the idea then is to try and pull that spending away from local government to central government to bring it under more control. By this stage, also, Winston Churchill has become a Conservative and he's Chancellor of the Exchequer. In 1925, he took Britain back onto the gold standard, and the value of the pound was overvalued, which meant that it hit export industries. So he thought, OK, what do I do about that? I know, he said, I will take away rates on business. I will reduce the rates upon local industry, and that will then compensate for the fact I've hit them with the overvalued pound. So this is what happens in 1929. But Neville Chamberlain, the son of Joseph Chamberlain, who was Minister of Health, thought this was a pretty bad idea. He said to Winston Churchill that this is going to undermine the civic gospel. So Neville Chamberlain, like his father, had been Lord Mayor of Birmingham. And as Winston Churchill rather nastily put it, Neville would have been was a rather poor Lord Mayor in a bad year. He didn't think he was a very good person. Churchill thought that what this was going to do, taking away the rates, was to release industry to become more competitive. What Neville Chamberlain said is that if you take the rates away from business, industry, so on, why would you, if you're a major business person, bother to stand for election to the local council? He said what you will do, you will hand the local authorities over to the workers, but even worse, to small ratepayers, and they will not be having the same feeling about the civic gospel as my father Joseph did. Well, it certainly weakened finances of local authorities still further, and of course at the same time there was a shift in the nature of local industry to becoming much more London centric. As joint stock companies are started, it was hollowing out the local elite anyway. The derating of industry was then compensated by Neville Chamberlain by a new system of central government grants. What Neville Chamberlain said was he would set a minimum standard for the authorities to meet, rather than handing over money as a proportion of whatever the council spent. He said, what I will do is I will set a minimum standard, and then I'll give money to come up to that minimum standard. Because he said, if you just give councils 10% or 20% of whatever they spend, some councils will be grossly extravagant, and other councils which are poor, depressed, will not be able to meet a minimum standard. So I will set a minimum standard and then allow top-ups to make sure that is reached according to a formula. After the Second World War, when Labour comes to office, local government finance was not high on the agenda of the Labour Party. They had other things to do, reconstruction at the end of the war, nationalisation of industry. They did, however, return to land taxation. In 1947, a development charge of 100% was imposed on an increase in site values. The problem with that is, if you have 100% tax, why develop? And the Conservative government then abolished it when they came back into office in 1951, and did very little indeed, if nothing, to solve local government finance. There was also a tinkering with these block grants from the centre. In 1949, the Labour government introduced an Exchequer equalisation grant to give authorities a bit more resource equivalent to making sure they met standards a bit like Neville Chamberlain wanted. So it was tinkering with the rate system. In 1964, just before losing office, the Conservatives did decide to look at reform of local government finance. Keith Joseph appointed a committee, and that committee reported to Harold Wilson's Labour government. And it found exactly what one might expect it to find, what we've already been saying, which is that rates were both regressive and inequitable. They then went through a whole list of what alternatives could be used. Taxation of site value, payroll tax, tax on energy, a poll tax, a local income tax. So it went on. That none of them would work. So there seemed that the rates were kept despite their obvious failings because they couldn't come up with any better solution. When Labour came back to power, it again started thinking about land taxation. Land commission was introduced and a betterment levy. But really the issue was just being kicked around. In 1974, Labour set up a committee to look again into local government finance. And the majority said that if there is to be, I quote, a vital local democracy, there needs to be more taxation. And it proposed a local income tax. But the question there was, how do you impose a local income tax if the rich people are living across the border in the suburbs outside the city itself? It was finally left to Mrs. Thatcher to take action. So when she first came to power in 1979, the rate system initially continued with only spasmodic and half-hearted discussion of reform until some bright individual came up with the idea of the community charge, as the poll tax was officially known. Flat rate, same amount paid regardless of income by individuals and not on the household. Now, the question is, why was a policy which turned out to be so disastrous adopted after so many other solutions had been rejected as not working? Indeed, poll tax itself had been rejected by that report I mentioned. Well, for a start, there was concern over the so-called extravagance of local authorities, many of which remained in Labour and indeed in militant control. And much of the cost of that so-called extravagance would fall on the central government at a time when the Thatcher government was trying to reduce the public sector borrowing requirement. So they, first of all, tried to reduce spending by reducing the block grant, by taking additional powers to withhold grants if spending was too high, by capping the level of rate increase in 1984, by removing powers away from local authorities, for example, selling off council housing, moving polytechnics from local government control to making them new autonomous universities. But there was then a big problem that the rates had to be revalued. The value of property upon which rates were charged had to be revalued. And if ever you revalue the rateable value of houses, some people are going to end up paying much more than others. There was always a resistance to revaluing property. Eventually, in 1985, it was decided to proceed with revaluing. And it started first in Scotland. And revaluation there coincided with an increase in house prices. The revaluation meant that the property base of rates went up very much, but at the same time there's deindustrialisation in cities like Glasgow, Dundee, and cuts in central government grants. In 1985, domestic rates went up by 21%, and most local authorities in Scotland were run by Labour in conflict with the Tories in London. There was a big concern, what will happen when rates are revalued in England? And Labour councils were challenging rate capping. They were refusing to set rates. So this meant there had now to be some way of breaking the system as it descended into chaos. And this is where the poll tax came in. It had been considered earlier and had been rejected as regressive and as difficult to administer. But it took on a life of its own within conservative think tanks. It was seen as a way of rolling back the state Remember what I said about 1867? If everybody has to personally pay, and it's not hidden away in some, compounding of rates or in a rate which is not as clear as a poll tax, then people will be more prudent. The increase in spending will immediately hit them in their pockets. If everybody paid the same, they would not vote for expensive policies paid for by others. Ken Baker, a leading cabinet member, pointed out there were 40 million electors in Britain, 18 million people received rate demands, 4 million of those had rebates, so that only 14 million people actually paid the local taxes, but 40 million voted. And it was even worse, he said, in inner city areas where very few people paid rates and they all voted Labour. Well, Nicholas Ridley, another leading Conservative cabinet member, said a poll tax was, I quote, a logical step towards greater local authority freedom. It should allow us, the central government, to stand much further back from local government because the electors will stand much closer. Rather curious logic that you're going to make local government more free by introducing the poll tax. So these proposals took on a momentum of their own in a mood of radical innovation that rejected all the traditional worries of those other reports. And it happened in a way where the cabinet was largely removed from discussion. It was a small group of enthusiasts like John Redwood. The Treasury had other concerns about running sterling. The Department of the Environment was hostile to local government, which it saw as out of control in the hands of Labour. The level of advice given by the civil service was woeful. There was no looking at how local government was financed in other countries. No other advanced country in the OECD had a flat rate tax. And Labour did not provide effective opposition in Parliament because the Labour front bench was concerned to distance itself from militant in places like Liverpool. So a major change was made with inadequate discussion and adopted in Scotland in 1989, England and Wales in 1990. At that point, the ideology of the advocates collided brutally with reality. The poll tax was aggressive, it was deeply unfair. The image of the widow living alone in a house paying the same poll tax as a household with several wage earners next door, rich bankers in a mansion paying the same as a poorly paid manual worker in a terraced house, and so on. So in Glasgow, there were 250,000 warrants for non-payment, and it contributed to the downfall of Mrs. Thatcher. The response of John Major was the council tax of 1993. The rhetoric changes. The poll tax was based upon a rhetoric of the prudent taxpayer voter. Now, the local resident was seen as a consumer of services, which were often contracted out and privatised. A citizen, the Citizens' Charter, as a consumer. The council tax, in a way, was going back to the rates. It was now based upon the household, the property, upon property values, not a charge on individuals. Properties were valued and placed in bands from A to H at the top. And that top band was properties worth more than £320,000 in 1991, all of which paid the same rate. Now, this was only slightly better than the poll tax. It was regressive. Properties in Band H are worth at least 8 times as much as those in Band A, but the top band pays only 3 times the amount of the bottom band. So it's actually more aggressive than the rates. In real terms, the council tax for expensive properties in central London are still lower than the rates in the late 1980s. So we're back now to where I started my lecture. There's a crisis in local government finance. Cities are going bankrupt. What solutions could we find? Well, let me, in my last few minutes of the lecture, see if we can find any solutions. That's a tall order in 5 minutes. How to deal with the current issues. Well, I think the current Labour government is trying to reform local government structure. It's trying to move, proposing to move from dual authorities, district councils, county councils in many parts of the country, to unitary authorities. Belief that that will save money. And you can have locally elected mayors, devolved mayors, that will revitalise vital local democracy. Well, that might well be necessary, but I think it avoids the main issue. How are you going to fund these local authorities? No answer. The difficult problem is being avoided in preference for reorganisation in a vague hope that will produce efficiency savings. This is not sufficient. And as you noted at the beginning, 61% of the total expenditure is upon adult and social care and children's social care. Where is the plan to reform the funding of social care? West Streeting has said a committee will report in, I think it's in 2028. So there's not really, I think, a radical solution being proposed. We see the problem of the inequities of the council tax. Properties have not been revalued since 1991. Again, to quote Paul Johnson, it is the only tax I can think of that is designed to be deliberately regressive. He said, it's rather like charging VAT at a lower rate on Bentleys than on Fords. So the figures here show the average property price. The northeast of England average property is worth £124,000. In the northeast, the disposable income is about £13,500, but the northeast is still paying in Band D property more than people in London. So it's a highly regressive and unfair tax. A typical Band D property in Workington, a depressed town on the coast of Cumbria, pays twice as much as Wandsworth. A 3-bedroom semi-detached house in Blackpool pays more than Buckingham Palace. Okay, so what can be done about it? Well, there have been a number of suggestions. One, suggested by the Lib Dems, was a mansion tax. This was proposed at conference in 2012, calling for a 1% tax on the value of residential property in excess of £2 million as a first step towards wealth taxation to reduce inequality. Well, of course, the Lib Dems then went into coalition with the Conservatives, and that was ruled out by George Osborne, and Nick Clegg went off the idea. He said, big time. The more I looked at it, the more I thought that's very crude. Well, perhaps more he felt it was electorally not desirable at the time he was in coalition with the Conservatives. Labour adopted the idea in 2014, but also backed off after it was defeated in 2015. Andy Burnham thought it played on the politics of envy. So mansion tax might have been a solution, but people were becoming very wary of it. One could at least revalue property and add a new top band. Clegg had suggested that. It's not been done. Politicians are too scared, as they were, of revaluation of the rates. The change would hit the better off and older generation, people like me, who are more likely to to live in expensive property that they had bought when property prices were lower, when we were baby boomer generations a few decades ago. There is a proposal from James Mirrlees, a Nobel laureate economist, who produced a book called Tax by Design. He suggested replacing the council tax with a tax proportional to the current value of property, the blue line going up there. And this slide comes from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which commissioned that report. And it's been taken further by a pressure group called Fairer Share. Fairer Share's report of a council tax proportional to the value of property has cross-party endorsement. Conservative, Lib Dem, Labour politicians have all endorsed it. This would be a fixed flat rate percentage of property value, not paid by tenants but by the owners. It means a revaluation at once and then an annual revaluation. The argument being that's now easier. We all look at property values all the time, don't we, on Zoopla. They calculate that 18 million households in England would pay less tax, so that 75% of households would be better off. 8.7 million would be removed from payment because landlords in rented property would pay. But of course, the problem is that some people would pay more, and politicians are more scared of the few paying more. It would only raise the same amount as the council tax, says Fairer Tax, but it would be fairer and it would reduce regional income divides. It might indeed level up. The next possible solution is land value taxation. So we go back to Lloyd George. This has been advocated by such radical left-wing organisations as the Financial Times. It pointed out after the last election that Rachel Reeves had the best chance since David Lloyd George of introducing such a tax. And they called for an annual tax on the value of land using exactly the same rhetoric as Winston Churchill had before the First World War. It's unearned income, it's an economic rent which is parasitical upon other enterprise. And it's what James Mirrlees had argued for as well in that report. As I pointed out in the first lecture this year in my series, in this country, a lower proportion of the increase in land value when it is developed is taken by the community than in any other country in Europe. So, could we do better than current Section 106 agreement to give more of the increase in land value back to the community? Well, I'll leave you with those thoughts. You probably guessed that I think one should do that. My conclusion is that we've had two attempted reforms of local government taxation, both of which failed. Lloyd George's land tax before the First World War and Mrs. Thatcher's poll tax. A third attempt might therefore seem foolhardy. Which politician is going to repeat the experience? But I think it is absolutely vital that we do that. And I think that at the very least, we need to replace the council tax by a proportional tax, which would be fairer and would help regional balance. There's also much to be said for land value tax plus better land value capture, which would help with provision of more housing rather than, again, the current government's policy. It will all be resolved by weakening planning controls. There's no lack of ideas, as I've been suggesting. What is lacking is a politician with a vision of David Lloyd George or, dare I say, Margaret Thatcher, both of whom were willing to act. Change is bound to annoy some people, but what has happened recently is that change to the tax system, like national insurance contribution on employers, is alienating people, without actually producing the fundamental reform which is needed. Thank you.